you know, we don't have it for this one. So I'm glad to have the YouTube overflow. So that's going to help us.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Hi, Megan.
Hi, so I'm going to begin now. You see my screen sharing? Yes?
Yes.
Great. So if we can all go mute.
Okay, that's my cue, and welcome everybody. Welcome one and all. Good afternoon to you from wherever you are, from here and just outside of Chicago. I wish you a kind greeting. This is our Hank Center event. It's another installment in our Catholicism and Dialogue series. And again, a kind welcome. My name is Michael Murphy, and it's my great honor to serve as director of the Hank Center. And on behalf of the Hank family, whose generous endowment funds our many endeavors, and on behalf of university leadership, I extend a warm greeting to you. You know, let me add also, of course, a greeting on behalf of our dedicated Hank Center staff, and that's Megan Toomey, who's our center manager, and Kathleen McNutt, who's our graduate student assistant, and our two intrepid undergraduate assistants, Catherine and Francis. We add that level of welcome as well. I'm so grateful for their work, and together we are happy you're with us. You know, as always, please check our webpage for our events. We have so much going on this semester. These are all Zoom events, and Zoom, I'm warming to it. I'm teaching through it, and you know, I have some thoughts about that. But it is working out actually as a for the center. We're getting more of a national audience. We're getting sometimes more people than usual, oftentimes more people, and it's also, it can be intimate in certain ways. So you know, there's something to learn, and I'm happy to learn it. So so thanks for tuning in with us. Just two upcoming events to feature. They both have to do with Pope Francis and Pope Francis thought. So we're doing a 1-2 punch on October 15th and 16th. The 15th event called Laudato Si at 5, just over 5 years old now, with Eugene McCarraher from Villanova, who's just written a tour de force, The Enchantments of Mammon. And a lot of his thought intersects with Pope Francis's thought. We're calling that Capitalism, Culture, and the Technocratic Paradigm, again on October 15th. The following day, on the 16th at noon CDT, we have an event called Fratelli Tutti, which is going to mark the promulgation of the upcoming encyclical from Pope Francis. The subtitle is A Conversation Addressing Pope Francis's new encyclical on human solidarity and its socio-political implications in the United States. Pardon me. That event features Sean Copeland, Bishop John Stowe, Carmen Nanco Fernandez, and John Gehring, and will be moderated by Ambassador Miguel Diaz, who's my colleague, our colleague here at Loyola. So that should be another time well spent. Today, sorry, these are all free events, but you have to register. So please note that. Today's event, Faith and Secularization, a Dialogue, promises to be a most compelling and engaging affair. The title, with its implicit nod to Charles Taylor's Moby Dick-like work, like, you know, very thick and brilliant. There's a nod to that with our title from his 2007 magnum opus. It doesn't quite capture today's focus, but it does serve as a good catch-all position from which to depart. Our guests will speak more about these kinds of things in due course and offer helpful ways to approach the secular and important distinctions among the many locations of belief and non-belief, immanence and transcendence, these kind of things. All three of our guests are well published in these topics, and I look forward to their insights. The main text of consideration for today is Jerome Baggett's The Varieties of Non-Religious Experience. And you can hear the riff on William James's classic text. Jerome's book sets us in a certain kind of terrain, and it's a terrain that really is kind of growing up along other considerations. I think here of books like Patricia O'Connell Killen's and Mark Silk's watershed book from 2004, Religion and Public Life in the Pacific Northwest, The Nun Zone, N-O-N-E, and Takaya Oakes's award-winning The Nuns Are All Right from 2015. You know, the rise of the nuns is, you know, that is these people in the States and around the world who do not identify with a certain religious tradition. This is well documented. But Jerome's book, it zeroes in on a population, a smaller subset, who self-identify as atheists. And as he'll tell you, he's interviewed over 500 people from across the States. He's always meticulous in his work, humane, good-humored, but very expansive and sharp. I can say that because I had him in graduate school, and it was a really great experience. we'll begin with Jerome as he speaks about what he found, and then Kaya and Paul will respond, and then we will no doubt move into a related complex of issues, all having to do with this complex of factors: identity, belief, non-belief, agnosticism, atheism, immanence, transcendence, and so on. So all this is to look at maybe how these things, how they motivate us to be where we are and live together, and hopefully to contribute more effectively to the common good and more humanely and critically to American civic life, which of course we are in dire need of doing that. I hope so, and that's our goal. So let me just introduce Jerome and Paul and Kaya quite briefly, then we'll get to it. Just a couple of housekeeping things. The chat is disabled. If you have a question, we will entertain them in part 2 of our gathering. Just address your questions to me. I'll collect them, and then hopefully we'll get them into play. That's really it. If there's a flow over here, this won't matter to you so much, but this is also live streaming on YouTube. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce our guest. Jerome P. Baggett is Professor of Religion and Society at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University, a member of the Graduate Theological Union's core doctoral faculty, and visiting professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. He's the author of Habitat for Humanity, Building Private Homes, Building Public Religion. That's from Temple, 2001. Sense of the Faithful, How American Catholics Live Their Faith. That's from Oxford in 2009. And his most recent book, The Varieties of Non-Religious Experience, Atheism in American Culture, from NYU Press. Jerome is currently conducting research for a new book project focusing on the nexus of imagination, culture, and climate change. Those are topics dear to me as well, Jerome. I'd love to talk to you about that. A person who, so thanks to Jerome for being here and accepting our invitation. Our next person is Professor Paul Lakeland, who is the Aloysius P. Kelly S.J. Professor of Catholic Studies at Fairfield University and the founding director of the Center for Catholic Studies. He is the 2020 recipient of the Monica Helbig Award for contributions to the Catholic intellectual tradition, granted by the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities. His most recent book is The Wounded Angel, Fiction and the Religious Imagination, which won the 2018 College Society's Award for the best book in theology. Congratulations on that, Paul. It's a wonderful book. I have it, and I'm about halfway through. I love it. Finally, I'm so glad Kaya Oakes accepted our invitation. Kaya is a machine. We just talked about this. She's always writing, and when she's not doing that, she's teaching writing. So Kaya has written 4 books, most recently including The Nuns Are All Right from Orbis in 2015, and Radical Reinvention from Counterpoint in 2012. Her 5th book, On Women Who Don't Fit In, is forthcoming from Broadleaf Books in 2021. Her journalism and essays on religion have appeared in The New Republic, Foreign Policy, Slate, Religion News Service, National Catholic Reporter, America, and Commonweal. Kaya teaches writing at the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome one and all, and Jerome, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you. Thanks very much for being here, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Paul and Kaya for being here. Thank you, Michael, for that generous introduction. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to participate in this conversation. I'm happy to be here, and I can't wait to hear your questions, comments, critiques, the whole thing. So anyway, thank you. Within only the last decade or so, public expressions of atheism in the US and elsewhere have become increasingly visible. For example, the number of atheism-related online forums, podcasts, blogs, video blogs, and all the rest is absolutely dizzying and seems to grow daily. Camp Quest, a network of secular-themed summer camps for kids, is now in a dozen locations across the US. The Secular Student Alliance, the national umbrella organization for campus-based atheist and humanist groups, only had 50 affiliates in 2006. Now it has 300 affiliates in universities and colleges across the country. Even atheist billboards are fast becoming familiar features of the American landscape. Why believe in God? Just be good for goodness sakes, reads one outside of Denver during, Christmas season. Quit the church. Put women's rights over bishops' wrongs. That's the Freedom of Religion Foundation billboard outside of St. Louis. And atheists make better lovers. After all, nobody is watching. I think reasonable minds can disagree on that one. Anyway, and that's outside of Westminster, California. A much discussed indicator of atheism finding a place within the wider culture is the unexpected popularity of 4 books, all bestsellers at some point, that take aim at religion. Sam Harris's The End of Faith, Richard Dawkins's The God Delusion, Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell, and Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. While these books are generally regarded as constituting the vanguard of what's been dubbed the new atheism, this term is actually misleading in that neither atheism in general, nor these books' arguments in particular are without precedent. What is new is what I'll call their offensively defensive quality. In other words, rather than trying to understand religion, which is presumed to be wholly nefarious in their view, or understand religious people who are presumed to be uniformly fundamentalist, they take the offensive and seek to explicitly eradicate religion. This, interestingly, in my opinion, is compounded by a kind of defensiveness that would be unfamiliar to an earlier, more analytical generation of atheists that includes such familiar figures as Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and the great Friedrich Nietzsche. Unlike these old, more secularly triumphant atheists, the new variant displays a call to arms urgency and conviction that rather than being on the ascendancy, secular ways of thinking and living are in fact being assailed by religious publics from seemingly all sides. So, why have these books sold so briskly? And more importantly, why did this new cultural space for the public expression of atheism open up when it did? Tough questions, but I would suggest a confluence of factors. The first, I think, is the emergence of radical Islamic terrorism. The fact that Sam Harris began writing The End of Faith the day after 9/11 suggests that this event may have had a comparable anti-religious effect on the broader American citizenry. Second, the intelligent design movement's political traction within America's public school system might also be a factor. Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett are distinctive for having each written important books on Darwinian theory, but many Americans no doubt share their fed up with faith reaction to the religious right and its promotion of creationism in public schools. Next, beginning with the baby boomers, but gaining steam thereafter, there seems to be a widespread and growing cynicism towards organized religion. One wonders, for example, if Christopher Hitchens' book's subtitle, How Religion Poisons Everything, not just some things, or a heck of a lot of things, but how that could seem plausible to Americans were it not for their all too vivid awareness of certain televangelist financial shenanigans, former National Association of Evangelicals President Ted Haggard's troubles concerning drugs and prostitutes, the Catholic Church's most recent sex abuse scandal, religious organizations' opposition to stem cell research and same-sex marriage, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Another factor is likely the end of the Cold War. With the fall of so-called godless communism, expressions of irreligion, while still often stigmatized, no longer smack as thoroughly unpatriotic as they once did. And finally, the emergence of the internet should be factored in here as well. Given that atheists have long been a scant, often closeted segment of the American population, it would be difficult to overemphasize this factor in helping people to consolidate their identities as atheists and connect with like-minded others. Thanks to the internet, observes David Silverman, former president of the organization American Atheists, there is no way that a person who is an atheist can think they're alone anymore. Okay. There are, however, and I think, plenty of reasons for them to think that atheists are misunderstood by the majority of their fellow citizens. And just by way of getting a lay of the land for what as follows, let me note that these misunderstandings are based upon hidebound but enormously commonplace presumptions about atheists and atheism. I'll just rattle off a few. Presumption number one, atheism is simple. Well, from the Greek, obviously, a for without and theos for God, atheism refers to any worldview that does not include God or gods. Sounds simple. But as is often the case, things taken to be simple are actually simplified. And we see this here. For one thing, notice that the term is negatively defined. We don't have terms like a leprechaunistes or a Bigfootist, because most Americans, even in Chicago, I would add, don't believe in little people guarding pots of gold or an ape-like hominoid roaming the forests of the American Northwest. This isn't true of God, though. Thus, the fact that we've naturalized the term atheism and use it so routinely actually denotes more about what's deemed normative within American society than it says anything meaningful about atheists themselves. It's also the case that the single term atheism can lead one to think of this phenomenon as a single monolithic thing, whereas in reality, it's actually enormously variegated. For instance, while most Americans who identify as atheists become an atheist after some religious socialization in this country, this is changing. Now more and more atheists don't become atheists at all, but 11% of Americans are born into secular households. They didn't need to bother to become. And for those who do at some point become atheists, the degree of transformation is extremely variable. Some people reject a faith with which they once had very little investment, let's be honest. Whereas others may have been deeply religious before they became atheists. And the distance that people keep from religion varies. For instance, some atheists consider themselves unabashedly secular and perhaps even anti-religious, whereas others might consider them spiritual but not religious, or even have a live and let live attitudes towards religion and religious people. And also the level of salience of people's atheism is important. For some people, atheism is a central dimension of their identity. Sometimes in sociology, we call that a master status. Whereas others merely happen to be an atheist and thus think about it as much as they would if they also happen to be brown-eyed or happen to be a Sagittarius and so on. A second presumption I want to do away with is the presumption that atheism is somehow new. And I want to be unambiguous about this one. What is new about the new atheism may be its offensively defensive tone, its spate of newly published books, and its newfound hearing in the public square, but it is decidedly not new with respect to its atheism, which is probably as old as religion itself. Okay. In fact, I won't dilate on this point, but because I can't give a full accounting, but the intellectual roots of atheism in the West are incredibly deep. They reach back at least as far as to the Greek philosophers of the 5th and 6th centuries BCE, who attempted to replace mythological explanations of the world with ones based on rational, publicly accessible assessment of facts. And two, these roots are surprisingly variegated. In other words, when it comes to thinking through religious identities and meanings, I discovered 4 very distinctive, what I call roots of atheism. I call them the empirical root, the critical root, the agnostic root, and the immanent root. And lastly, these 4 distinctive roots are still very much alive today. They continue to anchor and nourish irreligious sensibilities to this very day among American atheists today. Okay, so it's kind of like, in a way, I'm thinking of that great quote from William Faulkner. The past isn't dead; it's not even past, and it's not. These roots of atheism that were so obvious millennia ago are still very vibrant today. A third presumption: atheism as extrinsic. When I denote this presumption as being false, I'm pointing to the reality that atheism does not emerge from some outside source. It's very much connected to important developments in Western consciousness and, importantly, to the ongoing project of articulating theism itself. In his monumental book, which Michael mentioned and probably read, A Secular Age, Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor puckishly describes this mode of theological articulation as the excarnation. By this, he means, rather than continuing to frame what it means to be religious in a subjective mode in terms of communal bonds, in terms of embodied practices, pious dispositions, mystical experiences, and an overall sense of the apophatic, of mystery, religious sensibilities came to be construed far more objectively. In other words, they came to be framed as intellectual assent to objectified creedal assertions that, with the advances of modern science and the ongoing rationalization of consciousness, ultimately made it easier to disconfirm religious claims. This, in turn, made the emergence of atheism as a legitimate option, among others, nearly inevitable. First, of course, among intellectual elites, and then later among the broader populace. For the sake of time, I'll leave it at that, but suffice it to say that the emergence of atheism was not extrinsic to developments within Western theology. It was, as they say in those Hollywood heist films, very much an inside job. Okay. 4, I'm doing well with time. 4, atheism as numerically insignificant. Not so much. Globally, and calculated and quite conservatively, the number of people who say they don't believe in God or are not religious is somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4 of a billion people worldwide. And that's a lot. In fact, if conceived of as a religious grouping, it would be the 4th largest after Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. And in the United States, a very recent Gallup poll found that 13% of the American public does not believe in God. Now, let's be careful. While only about 5% of Americans self-identify as atheists, it's worth noting that this 13% figure is hardly minuscule. It shows, after all, that in the United States, the numbers of non-believers exceeds the numbers of Mormons, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists combined. Okay? And what's more, we also have reason to suspect that this 5% figure for self-identified atheists almost certainly undercuts the present and possibly future number of atheists in the United States. As for the present, there's almost certainly a social desirability effect in place here. Because atheists are a stigmatized group in the United States, there tends to be a naysaying bias on survey questions about atheists. Just like we know that there's a yay-saying bias on surveys towards religiosity, atheists are likely to lie in the direction of denying their atheism in surveys rather than confirming it. And then with respect to the future, the rise of the nuns, which I'm hoping that Kaya will say something about in a bit because her book's awesome. The rise of the nuns could very likely abet the growth of atheism moving forward. I say this for a couple of reasons. One, as many of you probably know, after decades of no significant change, one of the country's most dramatic religious shifts has been the sudden increase in the proportion of Americans who do not identify with a religious tradition. Nuns, not the sensible shoe-wearing kind, the N-O-N-E-S kind, okay? In 1990, only 7% of Americans said they had no religious preference. Now it's about 23%. Okay, and note that most of people who call themselves nuns are say they also believe in God. This is still important for atheism moving ahead. Why? Because their numbers are growing, especially among younger generational cohorts. Two, we can suspect that people's distancing themselves from religious traditions will likely mean a waning adherence to the central beliefs carried by those traditions, including theism, belief in God. And when they become parents, nuns don't do an especially robust job at socializing their children into religious membership, conviction, and so on. Okay, so I want to I want to clear the land of some of those presumptions. Okay, but let's now dig a little bit deeper. If I'm going to check the time, doing great. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper, and which is what I tried to do with my book on atheists. And I should probably just for fun, just to say that this atheism project, like many writing projects, probably the better ones, right, emerged quite organically. As some of these books were being written by the new atheists, I had students coming up to me and saying, "What's the deal with all these atheism books?" and so on and so forth. And I thought, wow, let's find out. So I would read them, and then I eventually taught a class called "The New Atheism in American Culture." If I may say so myself, it was great. And I remember teaching that class the first time. I've taught it 3 times now, but teaching it my first time. We're about 2/3 of the way through the class, and we had read Dawkins's book and Chris Hitchens's book, and we read about atheism and politics and atheist groups and atheists, this and that. It was great. It was great. But about 2/3 of the way through that course, one of my students, who identified as an atheist, by the way, I mean, easily done, it was a Catholic seminary. I'm kidding. We're not recording this, are we? One of my students, who I'll call Stephen, said, I really like this course. It was getting close to grading season, so I knew that was coming. But he said, we've been reading a lot of these atheist intellectuals and a lot of these atheist, polemical folks, and a lot of atheist activists, and a lot of 24/7 dyed-in-the-wool atheists. And he says, where the hell is everybody else? And I thought, wow, okay. Stephen's onto something. Where the hell is everybody else? So I thought, well, this could make a really good project. So I went to atheist conferences, and I went to atheist meetup groups, and I went to atheist beer not God groups. I took notes, and I did participant observation, and I drank beer. I went to an atheist film festival in San Francisco's iconic Roxy Theater, by the way. You should visit when you're in town. And then it hit me. I started to see the same people again and again at these places. And in fact, I saw one of the 6 movies I saw in that festival was interviewing atheists. And about 2/3 of the people in the documentary were also in the audience. And I said to myself, where the hell's everybody else? So Stephen's question actually became my question. Where is everybody else? And that's really an important thing, because people who are group members identify as atheists in that robust way are different from people who happen to be atheists. Just the way, like, if you go camping sometime and you have to get up to pee in the middle of the night, you look up at the stars, and what do you see? You see easy to see things, constellations. But you have to remind yourself, there's a lot of dark matter. Much of the universe is comprised of dark matter. And I think a lot of the studies of atheism that I had read and assigned to my students were studies of easy to see atheists, people who got involved in these groups and so on. But they weren't seeing Joe and Josephine Schmo atheists. They weren't seeing the dark matter. So that's what I wanted to investigate. And I don't know if people are interested in methodology. I am. But so I basically just started. I started in the Bay Area by interviewing people. These were all 2-hour interviews. And then I advertised in all sorts of different places. And I would only advertise for like a day or two, because once I got some volunteers, I didn't want people who just went to those websites. And then we did what we call a snowball sample. I would interview somebody and then ask if they knew other people who identified as atheists and so on. And then I did phone interviews in 49 of the 50 states, sorry, Alaska. And then I was interviewing so many people, it was going to kill me. And I realized, what do I know about atheists is that they tend to be well-educated, have something to say and no way to say it. So then I would ask many of them to simply respond to my questionnaire in my surveys in writing, which many of them did. So I had a total of 518 atheists, and literally, I think it was 5,000 or 6,000 pages of transcripts. So that's what I did. But so you don't have to read all this. Let me tell you just some key insights, just as a teaser that I found. One, lived atheism is very different from official atheism, okay? In other words, from the Hitchens and Dawkins and so on, so forth. In a lot of ways, one, the atheists that I interviewed had no problem saying, I don't know. They really demonstrated that agnostic theme extremely well. But in a way, their unknowing was a way of knowing something. They knew something about themselves. They articulated themes of open-mindedness and epistemological humility, which is in scant supply in some of these polemical texts. Two, they really resisted scientism, thinking of science as the only way of knowing. Many of them said, I don't believe in meaning with a capital M, but I believe in meaning in the personal sense. In other words, they believed in a lot of cultural scripts that they appropriated and deployed to make sense of their lives and render them meaningful. About a third of them said that spirituality was very important to them. It tended to follow what I call the if this, then yes pattern. If by spirituality you mean the feeling of awe I feel, when I go camping, or when my child was born, or what those moments, if that's what you mean by spirituality, then yes, I am spiritual. And then they were also much more discerning when it came to religion. They had much more of a hermeneutic of generosity when it came to religion. They were much less critical about people's belief in God than they were people's belief in certain understandings of God that they thought that led to negative outcomes, judgmentalism, and so on and so forth. They were much less critical of religiosity, which they saw as an attempt to find out about the world. They didn't have all the answers either, than they were about codified, objectified religions. And they were, of course, much less critical of religious people whom they were friends with, who they were neighbors with. About half of the ones who were married to a religious person than they were to religious institutions themselves, okay? Insight number two, an imagined community of fellow atheists is more important than actual ones. Among the religious groupings in the United States, atheists are least likely to say that belonging to a community of people who share their values and beliefs is very important to them. They were the least likely. Only 22% of atheists say that. Most atheists are not the constellations. They're the dark matter. They don't show up at the groups. They don't show up at the Beer Not God meetups, etc. However, even though the vast majority of atheists don't participate in online or in-person communities of like-minded others, they see themselves as part of an imagined community because they engage in similar boundary-creating discursive practices. In other words, one, they tell what I call stigma stories. Because Americans so often conflate religion and morality, atheists get stigmatized. They are construed as an immoral other, okay? Now, this does not reflect reality. There's no data that shows that atheists are less moral than anybody else, but It means that they have all sorts of stories about slights they endured, difficulties they faced, rejections they suffered. They all have these stories that they could deploy as ways of seeing them as separate from their religious fellow Americans. Two, they tend to accentuate the purported irrationality of believers because American atheism tends to be of a scientific form of atheism that counterpoises religion and reason, religion and irreason with science and reason. Okay. They cast believers as the irrational other. Now, again, this conflict myth between science and religion, which has been debunked about 1 billion times, does not reflect reality, but it means that they create a boundary between themselves and their fellow, purportedly irrational fellow citizens. Culturally, they describe religious believers as insufficiently equipped to be rational. They don't have critical thinking. Socially, as believers as unable to be rational because religious belief is so normalized within our institutions hegemonically. And personally, believers are unwilling to be rational because religion gives them personal comfort, a sense of order, and so on. Now, remember our the famous W.I. Thomas theorem from sociology. Things taken to be real are real in their consequences. So things taken to be real, that atheists are less moral and thus face stigma, and things taken to be real, that religious people are the irrational other. They're not real, but they're real in their consequences in the sense that allows atheists to imagine themselves as a distinct community from other people. Third insight, I'm almost done, by the way, so thanks for your patience. Third insight, and this was as subtle as a punch in the gut. All the research I read talked about atheists in the United States as being of a higher educational achievement, which is true, tend to be quite intellectual, which tends to be true, and so on and so forth. But the thing that I was surprised by was and this is the reason, as Michael suggests, that I give a shout out to William James in his varieties of religious experience. This is the reason, because I was completely unprepared to hear all the emotion language, all the feeling language in these long interviews. Totally shocked, but it was totally unambiguous. A way of putting this is atheists tend to consolidate and deploy their emotions to give a sense of periodization of their lives, to narrate their lives. They feel regret for a religious past. They feel free in the present from the religious chains, et cetera, and they feel responsible for an as yet unscripted future that they can participate in, okay? And also, I think most importantly, feelings performed what Freud called a signal function for people. In other words, just the way that religious people know that they're on the right track religiously because they have distinctive practices, collective rituals, creedal affirmations, atheists access their emotions as a kind of affective affirmation that they're on the right track as non-believers. Okay, so religious people have all sorts of things to know if they're on the right track. Atheists appropriate and think about and deploy their feelings as a way of doing that. Last bit, doing sociology, or practicing what the great sociologist Max Weber calls Verstehen, means understanding atheism in more positive terms. Oh, I should probably say, as you know, Verstehen is the German word for understanding. But in Weber's very distinctive usage of that term, he meant an understanding of the other on the other's own terms. When I look at Michael, I don't say he's a lousy sociologist and Red Sox fan, because that would be imposing my categories, projecting my normative suppositions onto him. He's playing a different game. And if he's a Cubs fan, we'll call that a losing game, for example. All right, enough.
I just unmuted myself. I need to defend myself, Jerome, but I hear you. That's a great point.
Thanks, Michael. So by practicing Verstehen is the most difficult thing to do in sociology. So if we can kind of bracket the religious norms, et cetera, and so on, and I think we can see religious people in more positive terms. We tend to think of them as rejecting, in terms of rejection, abandoning religion, in terms of negation, not believing, in terms of absence, without faith. That doesn't make any sense. It's like we talk about non-combatants, but non-combatants just don't sit around not waging war. And we think about the unemployed, but the unemployed just don't sit around not being gainfully employed. They do other things. And the same is true when we think about atheists. I think they're rejecting, at least my data shows, that you can understand them less in terms of rejecting something than embracing something else, okay? So for example, when they counterpose religion and science, they're rejecting less than they're embracing other things. So epistemologically, they might be rejecting what they would call comfort, but they're actually embracing lives of integrity. Attitudinally, they might be rejecting what they see as closed-mindedness, but they're actually embracing open-mindedness. And in terms of consequence, they're embracing an understanding of progress, gratitude for this life, a responsibility for carving out lives of meaning on their own terms, okay? So it's easy to write off the polemical new atheists that we read, even though I love and miss Christopher Hitchens. But it's too bad that everyday atheists are so often found guilty by association and thus all too easily written off as well. Okay. However, when one practices Verstehen, when one casts them in non-stereotypical terms, acknowledges their real critiques of religion, and sees them as gravitating towards lives marked by wholly positive aspirations, then one realizes they have much to say that's worth listening to. It's hard to know what this has to do with the so-called secularization thesis. You could say, oh, it augments the secularization thesis because people are coming out as atheists. But then you could say, no, it actually shows what a religious country we live in, that people would identify them in terms of religion itself. So I don't know. I think it's a wash there. But I think atheists present us with a possibility of a more honest and capacious conversation about faith and doubt, belief and non-belief, and our ceaseless urge to profane the sacred and to sacralize the profane in our culture. In short, if they help to engender those kinds of conversations, then American atheists may enrich our public conversations about the sacred and end up, somewhat ironically, being a real blessing in the long run. William James, it just occurs to me, but William James has this, and I quote this, I think at the end, I'll check it out. He has this definition of saintliness from his varieties of the religious experience. And he says, this definition of saintliness is a feeling of being in a wider world, the feeling of being in a wider life than of this world's selfish little interests. That's James's definition of saintliness. But I think it resonates with what I heard quite often from the atheists I interviewed and talked with as well. So I think there's a lot of room for conversation that might deepen the kind of public discernment we have on things that really matter in our lives together. So thank you for listening, for those of you that did. And I will mute myself because that's what you're thinking you want anyway, and listen to Kaya and Paul.
Thank you so much, Jerome. I really enjoyed that. And I really enjoyed your book as well. I learned a lot from your book, and I had wished that your book was around before I wrote mine. So maybe in the time machine, we'll be able to exchange. I think that there's a lot of common ground between Jerome's book and the research I did on nuns. I'm not going to spend too much time explicating and unpacking who nuns are and what they believe, because I want to really talk today about the challenge of the moment when it comes to these questions about believing and belonging. Because many atheists, nuns, Catholics, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, etc., because of the pandemic, are asking a lot of questions about what communities they really belong to, and what does it mean to be part of a religious community, which are similar questions that atheists and nuns ask, which is, what does community mean, and what is community in my life? So The Nuns Are All Right, which is my book on the phenomenon of nuns, it came out 5 years ago. And in the 5 years since it came out, I've done a lot of traveling and talking about this topic. And I've been discouraged to see that the narratives about non-religious Americans have pretty much remained the same. No matter whether I'm speaking to a secular audience or a religious one, the response tends to be this kind of hand-wringing about the problem of people who don't belong to a religion, and a lot of generalizations, which Jerome pointed out as well. People tend to make kind of sweeping generalizations about non-religious people with very few specifics about them as individuals. Our methodologies were very similar. We both live in the Bay Area. It was easy for us to find non-religious people. I happened to be married to one, so I just had to walk across the house. But in other cases, I think that with atheism and then the nuns, a big problem is the fact that the public face of atheism is very off-putting to many people. So you get your Dawkins, your Hitchens, your Harris, when in fact the atheists and nuns that you meet in one-to-one conversation are a little less, they don't fit into the kind of generalizations people make about non-religious people, that they're lost, they're confused, eventually they'll find their way back. They're gonna see the light, quote unquote. That's just not true, because how are we defining seeing the light, and how are we defining finding their way back? And I really appreciated the fact that what atheists and nuns have in common, and something I learned from your book, is that they both really dislike this idea of being negated and being defined by what they don't believe. So nuns is a catch-all term that's used for people who, on a form, asking what their religious belief is, you have Jewish, Christian, et cetera, they check none of the above. But what they can't check is all of the above, some of the above, or some of the above, some of the time. In other words, we're entering an era when people's religious beliefs in America, and to quote Jerome's book here, both secular and religious Americans tend to be bricoleurs, in that they mix and match what Alistair McIntyre calls moral fragments, and they rely on these in whatever ways seem right to them at a given time. In other words, Americans pick and choose their religion these days. And this has long been true within Catholicism too, right? It has not been as simple as, here's a catechism of the Catholic Church, and you're going to go memorize it, and boom, you are now Catholic. I was just today, in preparing my notes for this, reading Gaudium et Spes again on conscience and the primacy of conscience, and how that conversation is so important to keep having. In other words, that picking and choosing is kind of what nuns do. So they are not necessarily none of the above, but more often some combination of the above. So their decision is to participate in religion in a kind of bespoke way, or putting it together in ways that work for them. But frankly, that's what everyone does who's religious too. They find the kind of religion that works for them and negotiate their way to a way of living it on a daily basis. So whether or not, in my research, I met Catholic, Wiccans, Jewish, Hindus, or Sufis who pray the Liturgy of the Hours, all of which I did, those are just average people in a lot of ways who are customizing religion to their moral and ethical view of the world. So in some ways, what we're rediscovering in this post-institutional version of religion, so we're sort of heading into a time when more and more people are participating in religion in post-institutional ways. In other words, identifying as fill in the blank religion without feeling like they have to participate in traditional ways. Pope Francis again talks about the primacy of conscience and has reaffirmed that. And again, that idea of conscience is I'm changing the pronoun here. Conscious is a person's secret core and their sanctuary. There they are alone with God, whose voice echoes in their depths. For spiritual seekers who are interested in faith, prayer, and religion, but not in committing to one single religious tradition, contrary to the stereotypes of atheists, agnostics, seekers, nuns, whatever you want to call them, or that they choose to call themselves, they're actively, in many cases, practicing a private one-on-one relationship with the divine. And so they may be secretive about that. I think we're living in a time of Matthew 6:6 in a lot of ways, and that people's experience of religion is going to become more private and less public. And that's reactive because the notion of politics and religion being intertwined is what pushes a lot of people away. And this is directly a result, if you look at the numbers and the way they've trended over the last 30, 40 years, it's directly a result of the religious right and the idea of the kind of Christianity that has become politicized and I would say weaponized in America has alienated 3 generations of young adults. So Gen X, which is my generation, millennials, and the kids that we're calling Zoomers. They don't like it, but I don't like being Gen X myself. So, and I'm sure boomers don't like being boomers. So anyway, so since Reagan, or really Carter, and that evangelical kind of Christianity coming into the mainstream and being mistaken for, that's what religion is that politicized version of religion. And then Catholicism has increasingly become politicized in America. No comments on that for now, but religion can feel it's a turnoff, and it alienates people because they would prefer, nuns would prefer their religion and politics to either be separated, or for people who claim a religion to actually live out the values of that religion and not in hypocritical ways. The recent downfall of Jerry Falwell Jr., for example, has led it's going to lead increasing numbers of younger evangelicals to recognize the kind of hypocritical say one thing and do another thing attitude that has been a problem in the leadership of with the Catholic Church as well in terms of the clergy abuse crisis. So I just want to say briefly about church attendance in the pandemic and this whole question about whether or not there are going to be more nuns, fewer people identifying as religious after the pandemic. There's no evidence that, so at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of religious leaders were noting like more people are coming to Zoom church than would actually show up on Sunday, but that has not sustained. So Barna Group estimates that 1 in 3 practicing Christians who were streaming church at the beginning of the pandemic, so 6 months ago, have now stopped streaming church. Cara at Georgetown just came out with a big study that revealed 36% of younger Catholics are planning, and only 16% of younger Catholics go to Mass weekly. Out of that, so 36% of them are planning on attending less after the pandemic than they already do, on top of which younger Catholics are less likely to stream and participate in remote worship services. So why that, I leave that to the Cara report is up, and there's a story in America about it. If any, I didn't write it. So this is just the larger shift away from younger adult Americans, people under 50 roughly, have less belief and less faith in institutions, whether that's political parties, banks, universities, or student loan companies. They just don't believe that institutions care about them as individuals. And nuns, or anybody who falls under that kind of broad umbrella of people who are practicing or experiencing a religious faith but don't feel a need to belong to a religious community, they are, they're not going to start going to church again just because the pandemic's over. So a funny question, I don't know if other journalists who write about religion get asked this as much as I do, but when I give talks on this topic, someone always says, how do we get them to come to church? These people who don't come to church, and I don't have an answer. So if anybody's thinking of asking that today, I don't have an answer. What I do see, though, is that in all of the research I've done, the problem with the pandemic is that the ties that people had to institutional religion that were already frayed are just going to become more frayed. So in other words, the disconnect is going to become more disconnected. That's at least where the trends are pointing. Ryan Burge, who you may be familiar with, who's also a sociologist and does a lot of statistical stuff. We did a panel together at Fordham in November. In Christianity Today, he's got some numbers on how likely it is people will come to church after the pandemic again. So I recommend people to read that article if you're interested in these questions. Anyway, to sum it up, I think the bigger question is what comes next. So Jerome's book helps us to meet atheists as they are. And when you talk to atheists, when you talk to nuns, when you talk to agnostics, they really crave to be known as people and not as generalizations. And I think that's just human beings generally want to be known as people. And given our distance from one another during the pandemic, the question of belief and how it's going to be affected by how distant we've become from one another physically, and is just it's an open question but I remain sort of optimistic about the idea of religion being very robust as an individual experience. I do think that that's very much still true. And faith at the bottom line is a mystery. And the next mystery that we're going to figure out as people who are interested in these topics is what's it going to be like when we come out of this monastic Zoom room isolation of looking into other people's monastic Zoom rooms. So that's what I'm going to say. I just really also loved, Jerome, your definition near the beginning of the book about how we talk about faith and how the words for it have changed over time from, words meaning loyalty or giving your heart to now it tends to feel more that belief began to be understood as holding opinions. And I think that's a problem that pushes people away from it today. It's less experiential and more opinion-based. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jerome, and thank you, Kaya. And I'm going to take a slightly different tack, which comes from the fact that I wear the hat of being an ecclesiologist. So I'm interested in how we look at this from the perspective of the church. And of course, from the perspective of the church, atheism and secularism for the longest time have been called a problem. And one of the great things about Jerome's book is that he doesn't treat atheism as a problem to be solved, but more as a reality to be explored and from which we can learn a lot about atheism and about ourselves. So the stress is on the varieties of religious experience. So there's a salutary warning here to those who would just dismiss atheism as a mistake, if not worse. I was reminded of this when I was reading a remarkable editorial in the current issue of the Chicago Journal called The Point. The issue is dedicated to the question of the future of the nation state. But the point of the editorial was to warn the philosophers and other thought leaders, don't you hate that word, who subscribe to the point, not just to dismiss any appeal to nationhood as the backward-looking convictions of the ignorant. And they conclude with a warning that if people like us want to replace the nation state system with something more just or more democratic, they say, we had better find a way of taking seriously the passions and perspectives of the people it has produced. It's because so-called smarter people dismiss the perspective of the, quote, basket of deplorables that we're in the dire political mess we have today. And in a similar way, if we dismiss the secular perspective on life and even on religion, we contribute to a problem that only a more empathetic approach can assuage. But how do we engage the secular world? So in the few minutes I have here, I want to explore what might to some seem an outmoded dimension of the theological enterprise, namely what used to be called apologetics. Two images come to mind. One is my memories of my one-time life in London, heading off to Hyde Park's famous Speaker's Corner, where the mix of the wise and the crackpot was on display every Sunday morning. Among them was always the Catholic apologist, the representative of the appropriately named Catholic Truth Society. And their job was to persuade the audience of the truth, or at least the reasonableness, of Catholic doctrine. The other image is of John Henry Newman's great book, Apologia Pro Vita Sua. In that extraordinary intellectual biography, the apologia is revealed as a form of confession. Now, in both cases, I want to suggest, apologetics is to be understood as a form of purposive presence to the crowd in the park or to the reader in the study. So what is the purposive presence of the Catholic tradition, and especially of Catholic theology, to a secular world? Many have written about this. Charles Taylor himself, at what we all agree was great, even excessive length. I'll just suggest quickly 3 resources for consideration. The first of them is the one that both Jerome and Kaya have referred to already, and it's like the default text on relations between the church and atheism. It's in a few paragraphs in Gaudium et Spes. So that's my first resource. Section 19 in that document introduces the topic of atheism as essentially a product of defective religious practice. When the Council Fathers say that believers can have more than a little to do with the rise of atheism, which I think is a point that Jerome was making there. But it's in sections 40 to 44 that they really get to the point, discussing the mutual relationship of the church and the world. That the church has much to teach the world is not surprising to hear from them. But I often wonder how Pope Pius IX would have reacted to section 44, headed, What the Church Receives from the Modern World. This whole section is about open dialogue and mutual benefit. And the key line is actually in section 42. I quote the Council Fathers here. The impact which the church can have on modern society amounts to an effective living of faith and love, not to any external power exercised by purely human means. So that phrase, an effective living of faith and love, as the perspective that church people ought to have, I think Jerome has made very clear, has a parallel in the world of the secular world. So keep that little phrase in mind. My second resource is perhaps someone not terribly well known, unfortunately here, an Australian ethicist, Robert Gascoigne, in his book, The Church and Secularity. So he argues that it's part of the church's mission to assist liberal secular societies, quote, to tell their better stories. So he works with Augustine's discussion of the two loves in the city of God. And Gascoigne argues that the forceful witness of the church to the love of God and the neighbor and its resistance to self-centered love is key. Our loves, he says, have radical social and political implications. The challenge for the church, a challenge not always embraced, is to be a shining example of social harmony. Always, of course, with the awareness that the church is not to be seen as over against the secular world, but a player within it. And people of faith in this image aspire to be the leaven in the dough. Evidently, Gascoigne has digested Vatican II's call for an effective living of faith and love. But what makes such a society effective? So my third and final resource speaks to this. Here I turn to the most recent book by the Dominican theologian Timothy Radcliffe. In Alive in God, Radcliffe's pastoral and intensely readable approach to theology explores how Christian faith, he says, can make sense to our contemporaries, but only in the dialogical model in which Christians can be helped to make sense of their faith by anyone who, of any faith or none, and I quote Radcliffe, understands the complexity of being alive, of falling in love, of getting in a mess, of trying to pick one's life up and start again, of facing sickness and old age. We are all children of this secular age, writes Radcliffe, but because Christian faith, and this is his words again, because Christian faith is about choosing life, the fullness of life, its core beliefs intersect with the hopes and dreams of everyone who wants to live rather than just survive. So our challenge as people of faith is not to convert the unbeliever, but rather to revivify the moral imagination which secular society has certainly dulled for some. Restoring the sense of transcendence is about reopening the capacity for wonder, about putting wings back on what Flannery O'Connor called the wingless chickens of our age, those who cannot dream of anything beyond, those for whom the Mona Lisa is nothing but a spread of pigments on a canvas, or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is nothing but a sequence of pitched sounds of varying timbre. Apologetics, then, is the purposive presence of a people possessed of imagination and love of life, as they seek in dialogue with the secular world, as they seek dialogue with atheists as fellow travelers in the love of life. There are plenty of dulled wits in religion and secularity alike. They are the challenge for all of us, believers and atheists. But I think that one of the things that is so clear in Baggett's book is that understanding varieties of unbelief is a necessary step towards building an alliance of mutual benefit. We should not look for this as a work of the institutional church, not only because the church itself may currently be a species of wingless chicken, having lost its prophetic edge, but more importantly, because the atheists among us and even the knowns of our own tradition are turned off by institutions. No, the alliance will be the work of the people. And as we look around us in the US today, it will be an alliance of critical importance to any kind of worthwhile future. Neither believers nor secularists will save us. Only people as people have a chance to build what Augustine understood to be the highest value of society. Peace as, Augustine's words, well-ordered concord characterized by mutual service. Thank you.
Well, I'm clapping here. I see Jerome's clapping. I think 3 wonderful presentations, and I really want to thank our speakers for their time and their expertise to construct such, to give us some thought on which we can chew. And I'm just going to stick right with Paul. I've lassoed some questions from the chat, and they're coming your way. But I'm going to stick right with Paul here and maybe kind of drill down, as they say in corporate land, on a concept that you just raised. If what is needed is a meeting place for all people of goodwill who are grateful for life and desire to live fully, with all that is entailed in that, you know, how might the arts be a meeting place for agnostics and seekers and theists and non-theists? How do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, of course, I think they should be. That's got mostly what was going on in my most recent book, which might be the reason you asked that question. Thank you for the plug. But the arts are not ideological. The arts display truth in a way, but they're not didactic. They're open. And so they offer, no pun intended, they provide a canvas on which people can gather, can debate about the meaning about the infinite number of meanings, the infinite number of possibilities that any great work of art puts before you. So, if I had to pick one good example I would pick, which actually is such a relevant example today, will be to look at something like Albert Camus' book, The Plague, which is deeply religious and deeply secular and unfortunately rather timely. So it's the fact that the arts provide us with an open space in which there is no official interpretation. There is no official line. There is no authoritative statement. The artist, it has no authority over what the artist's work means. As they all say, once the final period is put on the text, the author becomes a reader and the reader becomes an author. So.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Paul. Here's one I think that all of our even though all can engage that question, here's one I think that might be one for Jerome and Kaya as well. So, in Jerome's book, Jerome reveals kind of a different a tension maybe, but at least a difference between kind of the old guard atheists and the new atheists, right? There's a tension there. And, you see like Richard Dawkins, for example, they may earn it. Dawkins is a zoologist by training. And it's almost like having Aquinas talk about, zebra physiology when Dawkins talks about God. Maybe that's a justifiable complaint. But what we have though is kind of a public face of atheism that becomes off-putting even to agnostics, even to atheists, where you have a kind of battling fundamentalisms. Where Bill Maher, for example, takes the most cartoonish interpretation and turns it up to 11, right, of the faith of religion, amplifying a point where constructive conversation about Christianity, in this case, usually, is just not possible. So the unfortunate ascent of, but he's got a point in some ways, because the dominant strains of Christianity, as we know, are prosperity gospel and kind of neo-puritanical patriarchal versions, oftentimes, of muscular Christianity. And so Mary Ellen and Carol in the chat have kind of joined with this question as well. What might exist for people who somehow are atomized by any number of movements in religion, who are no longer attracted to those communities, but who increasingly they also are hungry for community? And one last thing I'll say, I'm thinking in terms of the sociology, Jerome, that we've tracked for 40 years now, I guess, from Robert Bella's Habits of the Heart to, is it Putnam or Wolfnow, Bowling Alone, to Putnam, thank you, Jerome, to Sherry Turkle's more recent, is it Alone Together? But all this atomization of tech, when we have all these cartoonish versions, people are turned off. The Roman Catholic Church has double controversy and cover up of the scandal. It's in a bad spot. So how would you think about people who are hungry for community under these, and maybe giving religion a second chance in some ways, or giving humanism a second chance in community? How do you think about these questions? So please begin, anybody who wants to.
I guess I'll start. Well, two things that just came to mind when you talked about the old vanguard. One of the things about the old vanguard is took religion seriously, and they were really dubious about what Dante called reason's small wings. Um, Marx was very doubtful of reason in a lot of ways. He knew that could fall into false consciousness, and Freud was very doubtful of reason in some ways. He talked about the subconscious and projection, or even Darwin, the intellectual darling of a lot of the new atheists, wrote very famously about the horrid doubt that occupied him, that if we're always evolving, how do we know what we think now is true when we might think something else down the road? So there was an epistemological humility that I think they kind of model for us, despite them, we talk about them as masters of suspicion and so on. But I think that's a place where atheists and religious people can really meet, that rather than just answering questions, in a silly way, rather questioning old answers and pushing each other and so on. So I think we need each other in that respect. And that brings us to the community question. I think people are always reinventing community. I mean, it's a word, I think it's kind of built into our national, it's the other side of the American coin. We're so individuals. So we've always been longing for community since the beginning of the Republic. But I think that's another place where we can meet, pushing back against the old questions, being doubtful of our reason, embracing the poverty of our knowing together, and also embracing together our longing for community, whether it takes secular shape or religious shape and so on. These are places where religious or secular voices don't have the corner at all. And these are just great, but I think we have to lead with, again, the poverty of how much we know. And I think that's another aspect of our lives. We're always trying to win. We're always doing the gotcha. We're always trying to win this conversation, win this moment and so on. And we don't never lead with our vulnerability. And I think that would be a really good place to start.
Thank you, Jerome.
Without plugging my own work, my way into this is to point to some things I've reported on. So one is this group called Nuns and Nuns, NUNS and NONES, and they are based all over the country, and they bring together communities of women religious and nuns. And so I reported on them and got to know them, and they just finished a 6-month residency at the Mercy Center down in Burlingame in the South Bay, which is the Sisters of Mercy, where 6 young adults who are NONES lived in the convent. And the women religious are embracing this because they don't have vocations. And so they see this as a way to pass on their charism, their ministry, their wisdom to a new community without seeing it as proselytizing or conversion. And then another form of community that I've experienced and really enjoyed is this, sponsored by Image Journal, which is a magazine that you all may be familiar with, that sort of is bridging the divide in the arts between secular and religious. And every year they sponsor an arts workshop in Santa Fe called the Glen Workshop. And it's ecumenical. It's there are non-believers there as well, but what everybody comes and does is make art in the service of this bigger questions about what we believe. And those communities that are created at that tend to migrate onto the internet, which Jerome also talked about, which I think is a really important thing to pay attention to in the pandemic, is how are people forming religious community or interfaith or non-faith community through social media. That's actually something we used to kind of joke about, but now it's actually the only connection a lot of people have.
Okay, thank you very much to you both. I just would think too, there's a vein here. Richard Carney's work on anatheism, God after God, is, I think, pursuing what Jerome's talking about with epistemological humility. and the kind of negative theology, apophatic, into the silence in lots of ways. So thank you, Kaya, as well. There's also a question, though, because you can't run away from this. The Jesuits are fond of saying things like, what is God doing over there? And that's a way of being humble, but there's still God there, right? You're still saying God. Paul was talking about Father Radcliffe's, looking at life. So we still have to navigate, the God of Athens or the God of Jerusalem, and the truth claims that this God makes on us. And I don't want to skirt around that. But what I do want to do is ask another question from our chat, and that's going to be from Susan Harmon. And she says, there needs to be a question about many secular organizations, and she says she's thinking about here the Church of Satan, goes out of their way to conduct community building and civic-minded activity. What rationale are they using for their altruism? How much of it is PR, civic involvement? Is any of it a holdover from a religious upbringing that leads to a lingering sense of guilt over inaction? Anybody? Paul's laughing.
I'm laughing because there's such a lot there that would need to be unpacked.
Yeah.
I do like the reference to community organizing. I think that one of the things that we haven't exactly touched on is the way in which I don't know what the right phrase is, but the non-elites, cultural non-elites, have to have community building needs to take place, at the grassroots level. But did you say the Church of Satan? Is that the example?
That was the example. I know it's jarring. Jerome, did you jump in, Jerome?
Well, I was just thinking, I think it's a really interesting example. And I think it's a really interesting example because I just saw a documentary called Hail Satan, which is actually really sociologically fascinating. But anyway, it was lovely. It's on Netflix. But what I was thinking about as you were reading that question from Susan was that, if you want to open a barbershop, you would get one of those red, white, and blue poles. And what do? They don't do anything, but they function that, you're not Sweeney Todd, that you are doing this thing. So religious outsiders have always used the functional equivalent of the barber pole, fighting in American wars to say, okay, we are one of the group. We have to be taken seriously and we're legitimate, or gaining political power. Or, and I would say, as Susan suggests, sort of like the way of signaling that you are one of the group du jour is kind of like through philanthropy, volunteerism, adopting a highway. If you form your own religion today, after going to the courthouse, step 2 should be adopt a highway. Sponsor a little league team. It's just, I think it's just another way of signaling that one is a legitimate group among others. I think that's it. We do that different ways in different periods in our history.
Let me jump in there because Kaya, I think you might have something here too. I'll let the crowd know we're going to go to 5:35. So we're supposed to end at 5:30, but let's go to 5:35. I have a couple of friends coming in, give me some clarity, and I appreciate that. That the Church of Satan is a free speech group, right? That's one way to look. I think Jerome, you're saying that. And then my colleague Michael Burns says it's not the Church of Satan; it's the Satanic Temple.
Yeah.
So, and he said quite astutely, that's like confusing Westboro with the Methodists. Fairly put. Kai, you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not an expert on the Satanic Temple, but I do think that an interesting pivotal moment that we're in, especially over the summer, was seeing how secular activist movements have become a way for people to gather and find community during COVID. So people, participating in Black Lives Matter in huge numbers around the world, and it being a non-religious, leaderless movement. It doesn't have a leader, and so it acts as a movement like nuns act in relation to religion. In other words, they don't want a leader, a religion with a leader, and they don't want a vertical, they want a horizontal structure. And so I think to the question, some of that is probably people trying to recreate religious impulses from those who come from religious background. But now that more and more people are raising children without religion, there are more people who never had that religious background. And so they pour their compassion and their care into activism in some cases. So like, for example, in the Bay Area here at the Black Lives Matter protests, there was not much of a clergy presence. In other parts of the world, there was. But in the secular part of the world, you wouldn't see as many clergy. But in Charlottesville, during the Unite the Right rally, there was a big clergy presence pushing back against the white supremacists. So it's an interesting kind of moment to look at that question.
Thank you. I think we have time for two more, then our speakers can make a final word if they'd like to. Here's one from another colleague at Loyola, Dr. Dickinson, and he says, I'll read the question, or the answer. Yeah, the question, excuse me. I'm thinking of Baggett's wonderful work in particular. How might a more general acceptance of atheist identities in public social terms become transformative of our political context in this country? Since atheists are traditionally one of the least trusted groups in the US, what might better dialogue and understanding with religious persons and groups do to change the partisan rhetoric? And or do you think there would even be a big impact on the political sphere if this were to happen? So I think anybody here, I think Jerome, that's led for you, but I know Paul or Kaya can certainly speak on this. Can you unmute yourself, Jerome?
No one's ever asked me that before.
I was going to say.
Usually goes the other way. That's such a great question. That, I don't want to give a trite answer, but I think I think that because we tend to conflate religion with morality, I think once people think, oh, they've checked the religious box, I'm moral, and so on and so forth. And we're not really astute in our moral deliberation. That's why we're so addicted to black and white and, these different camps and, progressive, liberal, all that kind of stuff. I think that if we open up our moral discernment and the public deliberation to non-religious ways of construing morality and ethics, I think people will realize, oh, there are a lot of ways of thinking through the good and the right and the just. And I'm only good at some of them. And so I think we'll realize that we need each other. I think we're really bad at ethical deliberation in the public square because I think we say, okay, we're religious. I don't need to get good at that. Whereas I think if we understand there are so many ways of thinking through ethical questions and discerning morally, then I think we'll realize, oh, this is a bigger space than I thought, and I only can cover a certain part of it. And so I need other people, not to be nice, not to be politically correct, but to round out my own experience and so on, because we all just live a small sliver of life, So I just think that's a wonderful question, and that's as good as I can do right now to do justice to it.
Paul or Kaya?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, I agree with everything Jerome said there. I think the biggest challenge, though, is to find a real venue in which this kind of exchange and openness can occur. What Jerome was talking about earlier was what we usually refer to as civic life or citizenship. And it's a pretty scarred situation right now. So finding the venue is hugely difficult.
Yeah, thank you. That's I hate to say it, but it's self-evident. I mean, that word is always one to watch out for. But my gosh, we saw recent things that really have displayed the hard straits that we are in. I think we'll leave it there. But I want to give a final comment. Kaya, do you have any final thoughts on this experience? what's working in your mind and heart?
I just appreciate having conversations like this. I think that hearing three very different approaches to the topic was very helpful to me. But just personally, like, I've found that the last 6 months, as isolating as it's been, have actually been a really good time to deconstruct a lot of assumptions that I had about faith and belief. And because, you know, in my own personal faith life as a person of faith, that I've had to really take apart what that means. But it's actually been really productive. And I think those are things that non-religious people do a lot. But I just want to thank you again, Paul, Jerome, and Mike, and everybody from Loyola for inviting me to participate in this, and to Jerome for writing this really fascinating, helpful book.
Thank you, Kaya. What a pleasure to have you here. Paul, do you have any final thoughts?
I think I'll give you one final thought. This is from a Brit, and going back to what Jerome was saying about billboards, atheistic billboards. In the heat of the new atheism, many of the writers were British, right?
Mm-hmm.
The British atheists came up with a billboard, which they put all over the sides of the buses in London and so on, typically British. The billboard said, British atheists, God probably does not exist.
That's wonderful. You know, that could be a good last word, but we're going to leave the last word for you, Dr. Baggett.
Oh, wow. Well, I would say there are so many things that are pulling us apart. I know some of you have counselors or ministers or sociologists or journalists and so on. And you just realize when you interview people and talk to people and resist that centrifugal desire to pull us apart, you realize that, well, one, these carbon-based life forms called humans are profound, and two, you debunk all these stereotypes, because we have such stereotypical access to people. Once you get a more robust understanding of people, you realize how much you don't know and how grand the people at the BART station truly are. And I guess the other thing was, I think I'm in a unique situation because before doing this book, I interviewed, I think it was 300 and something Catholics. Now, I'm not so sure, church leader so-and-so and Richard Dawkins would have the best conversation. But when I think about all the Catholics I interviewed and all the atheists I interviewed, almost all of them would have a great conversation. That once they can kind of like not lead with the labels and not label the other, it's amazing how much we have in common, and how much we have to talk about, and how much we need each other, because again, there's so much we don't know, and we only live one puny life.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's well put. I think I'll leave it. I'll get the last word for the great Jesuit paleontologist mystic, Teilhard de Chardin, who says this, and this is something we can walk away with: the world is round so that friendship may encircle it. Friends, have a good evening, and give us a look online, but please take good care, and all the best to each of you. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to see you again, Michael.
Thanks, Jerome.
My pleasure, very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Good night, Kaya. Thanks.